Hello Internet, I'm the Disney Brain, and many weeks ago, we dove into how well Pokemon worked on the big screen for its first 3 movies, films that really pushed the level of storytelling past what the episodic anime could deliver. And for 3 straight movies, we got to think about Pokemon differently, see and hear Pokemon differently, and feel Pokemon differently. And while the original trilogy had very notable problem areas, all 3 also had a lot going for them on a deeper narrative level. I know you're all thinking it, so yes, this longer than it has to be praise session is an obvious build-up to the question, why is Pokemon Forever so freaking bad, beyond its cringy title? Well, it's time to do as we always do, and take a closer look, first by investigating the plot. And the problems start right away. This movie begins by giving us an odd-sounding Brock voiceover. Maybe the version I have is wonky, but this whole pointless Pokemon recap sounds like the voice actors were in a broken down studio. And then we get our typical set up the plot introduction, which somehow lasts over 8 minutes. And in that 8 minutes, we get a little kid named Sam walking through the woods, drawing pictures of Pokemon. I'll save this detail for later because it's one of the handful of things I genuinely like about this film. Soon enough, Celebi, and by extension the plot, comes knocking. So Sammy saves the poor hapless Celebi from a Pokemon hunter, which ends up transporting him forward in time near an area where Ash and friends just so happen to be heading. Next, we meet the modern day Pokemon hunter, voiced pretty well by the one and only Dan Green. Technically he is called the Iron Mask Marauder, but that's a little hard to say, so I'm sticking with Hunter. This also marks the second time that the dark, evil Pokemon have been brought up in the films, leading me to conclude that Team Snag'em is almost definitely some kind of offshoot of Team Rocket, and these dark Pokeballs were almost certainly a precursor to the eventual creation and selling of Shadow Pokemon in the Ouray region. Also, I did think that was a neat interaction to help kick off a time travel movie. It's a film about past meeting present, supposedly, so it makes sense that a youngish Team Rocket icon would look to force a retired veteran into giving up intel, thus allowing this present-day hunter to continue where the past left off. Pretty good detail. Unfortunately, the pretty good details start becoming scarce once the true to form intro happens. So Ash is battling to kick things off, again, completely forgetting that he has a boat to catch. He even electrocutes his opponent, which is probably against the rules? Ash nearly falls into the water, and now the plot can truly happen with this human? Did they ever actually tell us his name? I mean, I know it's Mr. White because internet, but that's kind of odd. And oh yeah, Suicune is in this movie. For like 10 minutes. So White invites the gang to his neck of the woods to check out some quote-unquote interesting Pokemon. But wait, they've reached a waterfall. Oh well, guess we'll just have to turn back. Wait, it can fly? Ha! If you know how. We're only 4 movies into this cinematic Pokeverse, and they've already ran out of ideas for boats. That's what happens when every single movie to this point uses water to travel to the plot. What an odd and very specific Pokemon cliche. So, the girl Sam met in his time had a clone in the future named Diana, but neither factor into the plot meaningfully, so moving right along. Eventually, Ash and friends find the time-displaced Sam and nurse him back to health. They then go looking for Celebi, who for some reason doesn't recognize Sam at first, and Lord Almighty can Ash climb fast. So they take the Celebi, but uh-oh, here comes trouble. Team Rocket randomly helps the gang, and then they randomly join the hunter, who doesn't seem to care that Team Rocket screwed up his first chance at capturing Celebi. And if you were wondering what kind of impact Misty has in this movie, she takes an arrow to the knee. That's it. She walks around, twists her knee somehow, and that's literally all she wrote. Here's one of those scarce good details I mentioned before though. Sam using an old school Pokeball. This wonderfully conceived technological variation was the perfect venue for Sam to be used as a way to connect past and present. But all of the myriad of questions the gang should have about a time foreign to them never ever get asked. In fact, they all act very casual about this whole time-traveling child thing. And so does Sam for that matter. He doesn't know for a fact that he'll ever be able to get home again, but even then, he doesn't seem to care that much. These movie makers do remember that real emotions make films better, right? It has only been a year, and they somehow forgot. So the gang beats the hunter's companion Pokemon, and then they are led to the Lake of Life. True to its name, it restores Celebi's life. And Jesus Christ, does this so-called movie not feel even the slightest bit cinematic? Sam and Ash are literally flying through the sky, and they made it look awful. What could have been a breathtaking telekinetic moment had more in common with a 10-year-old making a flip book and slapping it on the screen. They got this right before. They got this very right before. So why does it seem so lazy now? This entire half-assed sequence makes me think this whole thing was supposed to be an extended episode of the anime at best, but certainly not a feature film at $17 a ticket. That's pre-tax. So nighttime eventually falls upon the gang. The perfect time for Sam and Ash to do that past to present connecting thing I mentioned. Maybe even start to gauge Sam's initial interest in studying Pokemon beyond just drawing them, since, spoiler alert, he was this guy the whole time. But instead, all we got is an all too brief conversation about mothers that doesn't do much for either party. We already know how the Ketchum family dynamic works, at least on the surface, and Sam won't tell Ash anything of value other than mother's worry. He's a walking piece of intrigue, the younger version of one of the franchise's most important characters, and yet he might just be among the most boring one-off Pokemon movie characters. Maybe the point of it all is that young Professor Oak was just another kid, but if they didn't want to put any effort into justifying having Sam Oak specifically as a main character, then why bother? The reveal is obvious enough, so might as well make it mean something. So then the next morning arrives, and something actually happens in this movie. Celebi gets captured and is turned evil, leaving us with this horrible looking CGI nightmare. Speaking of CGI, they used it a couple times in this movie when they really shouldn't have. Even by the standards of the time, it looks clunky and dated. Also, Jessie is covered in vines. Because anime? But I did like the fact that this hunter actually had ambitions, clear ones. In a move that feels similar to Ronin's betrayal of Thanos, the hunter actually wants to supplant his boss and not just appease him. It would have been better to get some background on why he wants to do this other than to do it, but hey, that's Pokemon Forever for you. Lots of intrigue, but nothing is actually interesting. Oh, right, Suicune is in this movie, and he's terrible. He's just standing there not doing much of anything for half his scenes, like how he does nothing to stop Onyx from getting beat up long before he actually attacks. Speaking of the Rock Snake, he's the real MVP of this film, just because of this beautiful tail whack, skipping the OP Tyranitar across the lake and likely ending it. And with his last breath too. Onyx spent his Pokemon 3 cameo getting dumped on by Fanfi, but he was not having it tonight. But on the opposite spectrum were James and Meowth, two people who supposedly care about Jessie, but didn't even try to save her. I mean seriously, they just watched the rest of the movie, and then barely reacted when she damn near died inside that CGI abomination. Speaking of reactions, Celebi is dying now, and here come the waterworks. That's funny. I didn't see these two crying for Ash when he essentially committed suicide. But thank goodness they at least had the restraint to not create another magical tear situation in favor of... Okay, alright, no, we're done here. We're done here. So, then we reach the obvious big reveal. Sam was Professor Oak the whole time, yay, and the movie mercifully ends. Let's start the character breakdown with the Pokemon Professor himself. The detail of Sam being an artist as well as a trainer is actually a really good one, for a few reasons. We know that Sam eventually becomes a professor and the inventor of the Pokédex, so his drawings being the inspiration for creating a literal database of all Pokemon was a cool origin story of that invention. But that's pretty much where the cool Sam details end. Because as far as this movie is concerned, Sam could have easily been just some random kid who got lost in the woods and nothing about the plot is affected. The fact that he is Child Oak is never made to matter, and that's on top of the odd aging details, which I know, yes, odd aging is a Pokemon standby. Consider this. Present day Oak is around 50, and we can assume that past Oak is around 10. That means Gary, his grandson, will be born when this little kid is around 39. But it would also mean that Gary's older sister would be born at least a year or two before that. A little strange, but not unheard of. My simple theory is this. Sam doesn't strike me as the type of guy to knock up Agatha or whoever as a teenager, especially with how demanding his work is. So I think it was his kid that had a kid relatively early, and maybe that kid couldn't figure out how to raise little Gary or his sister and simply abandoned them. Maybe that's why Oak never brings up said kid, be it son or daughter, and why he's the only one really watching over his grandson. And maybe that's why Gary is such a dick in the anime, and why he needed an entire cheer squad lauding over his accomplishments. If that's not a coping mechanism for some heavy psychosis, nothing is. But getting back to the film, as is, Sam really doesn't do anything or learn anything or develop in any conceivable way. And since present day Oak knows about all these events, it would feel extra gimmicky if his remembering Ash's Pikachu is what led to the events of episode 1. And that's without bringing up the whole 150 original Pokemon inconsistency, since Oak has clearly seen Gen 2 Pokemon already. On top of all of that, Sam literally gives up on returning home halfway through, not even so much as reacting to leaving behind the only life he's ever known. It's been 40 years. For all he knows, his worrying mother could have passed away by now. And if his first action was to try calling her immediately after realizing his situation, that would be all kinds of poetic, whether she was alive or not. And it would have been a nice way to subtly connect to the third film, where Ash's mom is more of a focus than even Ash is. But his going back home or not going back home barely registers. There's just no attention to detail here, anywhere here, and it ruins every shred of potential Sam could have had. I get it. It's a Pokemon movie, and flaws should be expected. But the previous movie had an even younger child character at the center, and it's exponentially better, both in terms of smaller details and big picture elements, and a lot of that is directly because of said younger child. Speaking of big picture elements, let's discuss the legendary Pokemon this go round. I think the fact that the star Pokemon can't talk hurts this film. Granted, there are exceptions both ways. I recently watched the very underwhelming Genesect movie, and those Pokemon voice actors did not help matters. Conversely, I think Deoxys not being able to talk added a great deal of gravity to its mysterious presence. But, just thinking about Mewtwo and Entei, both of their movies were vastly improved by both of them having a defined mindset. A mindset we only became privy to because they explained their thought process. Both Celebi and Suicune, on the other hand, come off as just powerful Pokemon. There's nothing especially interesting or grand about how they operate here, minus Celebi's power set. But then here's the question. Why does it matter that Celebi can travel through time? Your guess is as good as mine, and the movie sure as hell doesn't know. And that's because the concept of past meets present is so underutilized here that it feels like an afterthought. It's so jarring in that respect that I'd be shocked if original drafts of this story had Sam being younger Professor Oak. I'd sooner assume that at some point they just said, yeah, sure, why the hell not? That's a cool reference, right? And Suicune was less useful than James's wheezing, so there's next to nothing to say about him. Adding to that, there's also almost nothing to say about any of the other characters here, as they were all pretty much just going through the motions. All except for Onyx, of course, who still owns the best scene in this film. Pokemon Forever is the kind of stale, lifeless, directionless, pointless hack job of a film you get when a flawed, but ultimately creative, visually engaging, and passionate team of filmmakers run dry on inspiration. What is this movie even supposed to be about? Eco-terrorism? Not really. The concept of past meets present? Probably not, and we discuss why in great detail. Maybe it's all about treating Pokemon right? Which is pretty much the idea behind anything Pokemon ever created ever. So why did this need to be a film? Ah, that's right, to make money presumably, since there was no real story to tell. Speaking of money, Pokemon Forever made around 10 times less in the American box office compared to Pokemon 3. Which in turn led to the death of theatrical Pokemon releases after Pokemon Heroes, up until I Choose You late last year. And ironically enough, several of those non-theatrical films are vastly superior to this one. In closing, Pokemon Forever is an abysmal Pokemon film, even judged by the tempered standards of Pokemon films. Instead of asking sizable important questions, we get next to no questions or interesting information. Instead of giving us a uniquely captivating visual and musical story, we get a forgettable score and terrible CGI, oddly mixed into the backdrop of drawn animation, and instead of giving us a deeply personal story rooted in loss, despair, and the innocent mindset of childhood used to try and mentally overcome both, we get a largely impactless, emotionless, paint-by-numbers kid, except the numbers don't add up. But in fairness, the only films I'm really using to judge this one are the previous three. I'll probably keep reviewing the movies, but it's at this point where my memory of them grows fainter. On top of that, I'll be experiencing several films for the first time, so we'll see how that goes. My only hope is that things never, ever get as bad as this, which would honestly be hard to pull off. But until then, thanks for watching.